Tomorrow, most of the country will celebrate the day America declared independence. Fireworks at exactly the right moment, on exactly the right date, for exactly the reason we all learned in school. Almost none of it is true. The vote didn't happen on the 4th. The signing didn't happen on the 4th. And the document itself, the one framed in the National Archives right now, was edited at the last minute to cut a passage that might have changed the next 250 years. By the end of this, you'll know what actually happened that summer, and why the real story is stranger and darker than the one on the fireworks box. Let's start with the date itself, because even that isn't right. The actual vote for independence, the moment the colonies broke from Britain, happened on July 2nd, 1776, not the 4th. John Adams was so certain that date would go down in history, he wrote to his wife that Americans would celebrate it for generations, with parades and bonfires, from one end of this continent to the other. He picked the wrong day by 2. What happened on July 4th was smaller. Congress simply approved the wording of the announcement, the declaration itself, after 2 more days of edits. It's the press release, not the vote. And here's the part almost nobody knows. That famous document, the one with all 56 signatures, the one you picture when you picture the 4th of July, most of those signatures weren't even on it yet. The elegant copy, the one on display today, wasn't ready until August 2nd, a full month later. That's when most delegates actually put pen to parchment. A few didn't sign until the fall. One signature wasn't added until January of the following year. So the document that defines the 4th of July wasn't finished on the 4th of July. But the date isn't even the strange part. The strange part is what got left out. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft alone, in a rented room, over about 2 weeks. And in that draft, buried deep in the list of grievances against the king, was a passage about slavery. Not a footnote, not a gesture. A direct, furious condemnation. Jefferson accused King George of waging what he called cruel war against human nature itself, of tearing people from their homes and shipping them across an ocean into bondage. In his own words, a market where men should be bought and sold. Read that again. The man writing "All men are created equal" had also drafted a passage attacking the slave trade as a crime against humanity. It never made it into the final document. For 2 days, delegates debated Jefferson's draft line by line. And when they got to the slavery passage, Southern delegates objected. Their economies ran on it. Northern delegates went quiet too. Their ships were the ones doing the carrying. Jefferson later wrote that the clause was struck out in complaisance to South Carolina and Georgia, and that even his own region felt a little tender about it. So it was cut, entirely. Not softened, deleted. And it wasn't simply removed, it was replaced. In its place, the delegates inserted a new grievance, one accusing the king of inciting domestic insurrections and of turning what the document literally calls the merciless Indian savages against colonial settlements. Sit with that for a second. The exact spot where the Declaration once condemned slavery as a crime against humanity became instead a passage demonizing Native Americans. One condemnation swapped for another. A single edit, and the moral center of the document quietly shifted. Bruh. That sentence is still there. It's in the Declaration of Independence right now, on display in Washington, described as America's founding statement on human liberty. So when the document says, "All men are created equal," who did the people who signed it actually mean? Not the enslaved people building the wealth of the colonies they were founding. Jefferson himself owned over 600 people across his lifetime, before, during, and after he wrote the words, "All men are created equal." He freed only a handful, and most of those only after his own death. He knew, in exact legal and financial detail, exactly what he was excluding when he wrote that sentence. Not native nations, who the document itself brands as savages in the very same paragraph. Not women, not anyone without property. All men was a much smaller category than the phrase suggests, and the founders knew it. They weren't blind to the contradiction. Contemporaries said it to their faces. A British loyalist, reading the finished declaration, asked bluntly how the delegates from Virginia and the Carolinas could demand liberty for themselves while holding other human beings in bondage. The founders had an answer waiting, and it wasn't a good one. They simply decided that some people didn't count as men in that sentence at all. That wasn't an oversight buried in fine print. It was a decision, made in daylight, by men who understood precisely what they were signing and precisely who they were leaving out. 76 years later, a man named Frederick Douglass, who had been born enslaved, stood in front of a mostly white audience in Rochester, New York, on the day after the 4th of July, and asked them directly what the holiday was supposed to mean to someone like him. His answer still lands like a blow. He called it a day that revealed, more than any other day of the year, the injustice he was forced to live under. He said the liberty everyone was celebrating was, to him, nothing but a hollow mockery. He wasn't rejecting the ideals in the Declaration. He was holding the country to them, pointing at the gap between the words on the page and the world outside the window, and refusing to let anyone look away from it. That gap didn't close in 1776. It didn't close in 1852, when Douglass gave that speech. In some ways, the country is still arguing about how to close it today. And the holiday itself carried that argument for a long time before it ever became the version you know. For decades after the Revolution, the 4th wasn't a unifying all-American holiday at all. It was often celebrated separately, one version for white Americans marking independence, and, in many black communities, a deliberate refusal to celebrate on that date at all. Some instead marked freedom on the 5th, exactly as Douglass did, as a quiet, pointed statement, not yet, not for everyone, not on your day. It would take another war and another declaration entirely before the promise in that sentence started to catch up with the words. So why does any of this matter 250 years later? Because the version of the 4th of July most of us grew up with is a finished story, a clean one. Men in wigs sign a paper, and the country is born, fully formed, with liberty and justice built in from the very first sentence. The real version is messier and far more honest. A document written by a slaveholder condemning slavery until it didn't. A vote on one day, a date on another, and a signature that trickled in for months. A phrase, "all men are created equal," that took generations of people fighting, dying, and speaking, including one formerly enslaved man in Rochester, to even begin to mean what it says. That's not a reason to cancel the fireworks. It's a reason to actually understand what you're setting them off for. The 4th of July was never the moment the story ended. It was the moment a promise got written down, one the country still hasn't finished keeping. That's how it simply goes. We'll see you in the next one.